Imagine the weight of respect in your own city, only to have it shattered in an instant. Judge Reginald Hayes had spent his life upholding the law, commanding the respect of his peers and his community. But in a cruel twist of fate, it was that same community that would soon pull him over, question him, and humiliate him, simply for the way he looked. Can you even fathom the sting of such injustice? For Reginald, that one harrowing encounter ignited a fire he never saw coming. As he dug deeper into the situation, what he unearthed was more than just a broken moment. It was a vast, corrupt web, spun tightly by those in power. A scheme that used the force of law to strip families of their homes. Homes that were then sold off for profit. The corruption ran deep, and once Reginald and his trusted ally took their findings public, the entire city was forced to face its darkest secrets. This is the story of two men, who, despite the overwhelming odds, risked everything to bring justice back to their community. The evening air in Greensboro, North Carolina, hung still, carrying the kind of calm that invites a deep breath after a long day. Reginald Hayes glanced at his watch, the hands ticking slowly as he guided his car down Main Street. After hours of sifting through cases in the courthouse, the quiet of the street felt like a balm to his weary soul. It had been a week of relentless pressure, but now, this moment of peace was his sanctuary. But just as he turned onto his street, something shattered that peace. A flash of red and blue lights sliced through the twilight, their harsh glow pulling him back into a reality he didn't want to face. Reginald's stomach churned as the police cruiser followed him, its lights reflecting ominously in his rearview mirror. He eased his car to a stop near the curb, the cruiser mirroring his every move, its flashing lights casting erratic shadows across the street. "Evening," Reginald greeted, his voice calm, though a knot had formed in his chest. The officer who approached was tall, broad-shouldered, his face stern and unreadable. Reginald noted the name tag, Simmons. Without so much as a greeting, Officer Simmons barked, "License and registration." The authority in his voice was sharp, laced with a tone that left no room for question. Reginald, steady despite the tightening grip of tension, took a deep breath. He had spent his life facing authority figures who wielded their power. But now, here he was, on the receiving end. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his glove compartment, each movement deliberate and measured, as if he were on the witness stand once again. "Here's my ID," he said, passing over his credentials, including his judicial identification, hoping it would clear up the situation quickly. But Simmons didn't even glance at the ID. Instead, his eyes flicked back to Reginald's car, and with a dismissive grunt he muttered, "Fancy car. What's someone like you doing in a vehicle like this around here?" The implication hung thick in the air. Reginald could feel it crawling under his skin. His anger flared, but he swallowed it down. "I live here," he said, his tone cool, controlled. Simmons scoffed, as if he didn't believe him, and then, without hesitation, ordered, "Step out of the car." Reginald's heart hammered in his chest. How had it come to this? A career built on integrity, on upholding justice. And yet here he was, standing at the mercy of a man who saw nothing but suspicion. Still, he reminded himself, it was moments like this where restraint mattered most. As he stepped out of his car, the quiet of his neighborhood felt heavy, suffocating. A few faces appeared in windows, their curious gazes following the unfolding drama. Simmons began to search the vehicle, his every move deliberate, slow, as if he wanted Reginald to feel the full weight of his scrutiny. Time dragged on, every second stretching longer than the last. Finally, Simmons stood up, his face hardened with what could only be described as a grudging acknowledgement. "This checks out," he muttered, tossing Reginald's ID back at him. For a long moment, Reginald stared at the ID in his hand. It was humiliating. And yet he stood his ground, meeting Simmons's gaze with unwavering calm. He said nothing. No words could undo what had just happened. With a curt nod, he got back into his car and drove off, but inside his mind was spinning. This wasn't just about him. It was bigger than that. A system built on trust, on fairness, was broken, and Reginald was now determined to fix it. The next day, still shaken by the events of the night before, Reginald sat at his desk, the weight of the encounter pressing on him. For years, he had worked within the system, believing in its ability to protect and serve. But now, that belief felt fragile, shattered by the very system he had spent his life serving. As he lost himself in thought, the door to his office creaked open, and in walked Detective Brian Lewis, an old friend, someone who had stood by him through thick and thin. Brian took a seat across from him, his eyes betraying concern. "Reg," Brian said softly, "I heard what happened last night." His voice was cautious, but there was a firmness there too. "That Officer Simmons, he's got a history. There've been complaints, more than a few, from people around here." Reginald sighed deeply. "I wasn't doing anything wrong, Brian. I was just trying to get home. And suddenly, I'm treated like a criminal. This goes beyond just one bad cop." Brian nodded, his expression serious. "I know. I've been hearing about it too. People getting pulled over for nothing, targeted for traffic stops. There's one name that keeps coming up in all these reports: Prime Builders." A chill ran down Reginald's spine. Prime Builders. The name was familiar. He'd seen it before, in several court cases involving property disputes and strange evictions. "Are you saying this isn't just harassment?" Reginald asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. "You think it's organized?" Brian leaned forward. "I think it's time we found out. But this isn't something we can just bring to the chief and expect things to change. We need airtight evidence. Names, dates, something no one can ignore." A surge of determination washed over Reginald. This was the moment he had been waiting for, though he hadn't realized it. The humiliation of the previous night had turned into fuel for a far greater cause, exposing the corruption that had festered beneath the surface. "All right, Brian," he said, his voice steady, "let's get to work, whatever it takes." And so, the two of them set to work, quietly gathering evidence, piecing together the fragments of information that would unravel the scandal. The path ahead would be dangerous, but they had no choice. This wasn't just about one officer, one corrupt act. It was about shining a light on the entire network of corruption that had taken root in their town. In the weeks that followed, Reginald and Brian worked tirelessly. They dug through court cases, police reports, and witness statements. The evidence began to speak for itself. What had started as isolated complaints about Officer Simmons grew into a damning portrait of a conspiracy, one that stretched from the police department to the very heart of local government. Prime Builders wasn't just a company. It was a puppet master, pulling the strings behind closed doors, exploiting vulnerable families, and turning their homes into cash cows. The more they uncovered, the more twisted the web became. What had once seemed like random traffic stops and neighborhood harassment was part of a larger, organized effort to strip people of their homes, all for profit. And then one night, Brian arrived at Reginald's office, carrying a thick stack of documents. His face was grim. "Here it is, Reg," Brian said, his voice low. "The proof we needed." The weight of the papers hit the desk with a soft thud, but the gravity of what they represented was anything but subtle. Brian's voice was firm, almost cold as he spoke. "These are the files I could get, without raising too many questions," he said, setting them down on Reginald's desk. "Emails between certain officers and Prime Builders executives. Payment records. It's all here." Reginald picked up a document, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as his eyes scanned the contents. The words on the page seemed to hit him like a punch to the gut. "This is worse than I imagined," he murmured, barely above a whisper. "They're not just pushing people out. They're doing it systematically." He shook his head, the realization sinking in. "This isn't law enforcement. This is organized crime." Brian's face hardened, his jaw tightening. "Exactly," he said, his voice low, filled with quiet fury. "And that's why we need to act fast. The more we uncover, the more risk we're taking. I've noticed unfamiliar cars parked outside my place at night. They're watching us." A chill ran down Reginald's spine as he absorbed the full weight of the situation. He had spent his life believing in the law, trusting the system that was supposed to protect the innocent. Now he stood at the edge of it all, forced to confront a reality he had never imagined. But there was no turning back. This was his duty. He could either look the other way, as so many had done, or he could push forward, knowing the risks that lay ahead. "We take this public," he said finally, his voice steady but resolute. "We gather the last few pieces of evidence, and then we make it impossible for anyone to ignore." Prime builders and every official in their pocket. This ends now. Brian nodded, his jaw set in determination. There was no time for second thoughts. They would bring the story to the people. And in doing so, they would shine a light on corruption hidden in plain sight. The consequences of this revelation would be far-reaching. As they left the office that night, a heavy weight pressed down on both of them. What they were about to do could change everything. But they knew that there was no turning back. When the day finally arrived to go public, Reginald and Brian were ready. They had gathered a mountain of evidence. Emails, payment records, testimony from residents whose lives had been shattered, and even a few brave officers willing to speak out. Every piece connected back to prime builders, and to a small circle of officials in the police department and city government. It was time to expose the truth. They reached out to a local TV station, one with a reputation for investigative reporting, knowing that a live broadcast would ensure the story couldn't be buried. The atmosphere in the studio was electric as the broadcast prepared to air. Reginald sat in the green room, his heart pounding. The weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on his shoulders. Across from him, Brian sat, flipping through the documents one last time. Neither man spoke much. They didn't need to. They both knew what this moment meant. When they were called to the studio, nerves washed over them like a tidal wave. Reginald took a steadying breath, remembering every face he had seen in the court cases. Every family affected by this scheme. They were the reason he was here tonight. As the anchor introduced the segment, her tone was serious, her face grave. We're here tonight with Judge Reginald Hayes and Detective Brian Lewis, who have uncovered a disturbing network of corruption in our own city. She turned to Reginald, her eyes locking with his. Judge Hayes, can you tell us how this started? Reginald leaned forward, his voice steady as he chose his words carefully. This investigation began with what seemed like isolated incidents, he explained. But as we dug deeper, it became clear that these weren't coincidences. A number of people, particularly from vulnerable communities, were being targeted by the police through fines and other forms of intimidation. And every time, their homes were later bought out by prime builders. It's become apparent that this wasn't just harassment. It was a coordinated effort. The camera shifted to Brian, who held up a stack of documents, showing them to the camera. We have records, he said, his voice carrying the weight of the truth. Emails between executives at prime builders and high-ranking officials. Money being exchanged for influence. Pressure on officers to focus on certain areas, and orders to overlook certain crimes. This was a system designed to take people's homes and turn them into profit for a select few. The studio fell silent as the weight of the scandal settled in. The anchor's face tightened as she asked, "Are you saying that prime builders, with support from certain officials, targeted specific neighborhoods to acquire property for development?" "That's exactly what we're saying," Reginald replied, his voice unwavering. "And these weren't just numbers on a page. These were families. People who trusted this system to protect them. We have evidence of harassment, wrongful arrests, fines for minor infractions, all as a way to push them out of their homes." Brian nodded, his eyes fierce. "There are good officers in our department who tried to speak out, but they were silenced. This isn't just about bad cops or greedy developers. It's a systemic failure." The anchor paused, her face somber. The weight of their words hung in the air. "What do you hope will come from this?" she asked softly. Reginald met her gaze, his voice steady, resolute. "Justice for every person affected. Accountability for every official involved. And a reminder that no one is above the law. Not even those who enforce it." The broadcast ended, but the impact was immediate. Calls flooded the station. Viewers were shocked, outraged. News of the scandal spread like wildfire, sparking protests and demands for action. The next day, the city was alive with demonstrations, and the police department and city officials found themselves under intense scrutiny. Reginald and Brian had done it. They had exposed a corrupt system. But as they left the studio that night, they knew the fight was far from over. They had struck a nerve, and those who stood to lose from this revelation wouldn't back down easily. The days following the broadcast were a whirlwind. Reginald and Brian found themselves at the center of a storm, exhilarating, yet dangerous. Their phones buzzed constantly with messages of support, requests for interviews, and even threats. Despite the tension, the public response was overwhelmingly positive. Crowds gathered outside City Hall, holding signs demanding accountability. "Our homes, our rights," one banner read. Reginald watched these scenes unfold on the news, feeling both vindicated and heartbroken by the sheer number of people affected. City officials quickly placed several officers on leave, including Officer Simmons, and announced a full investigation into prime builders. It was a victory, but Reginald and Brian knew this was just the beginning. Real change would take time, and the threat of retaliation loomed large. One evening, Reginald returned home to find Evelyn waiting for him, her face tight with worry. She held a small envelope, and when she handed it to him, her hands trembled. "This was left on our doorstep," she said quietly. Reginald opened the envelope and found a single slip of paper with a chilling message. "Back off, or there will be consequences." A cold shiver ran down his spine, but when he looked at Evelyn, he knew fear couldn't outweigh his responsibility. "They're scared," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "They know they're losing control, and they're desperate." Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The next day, Reginald and Brian met with city officials and community leaders to discuss the path forward. The room was thick with tension, especially from those who had been complicit or had turned a blind eye. But the voices of community leaders, residents who had been directly affected by prime builders, cut through the silence. "We're not here to just put a few people on leave," one leader said, her voice firm. "We want a commitment to real change. Training for officers, a task force to review policing practices, and complete transparency moving forward." Reginald spoke, his voice clear and resolute. "What happened in our community is a betrayal of trust. This isn't just about a few corrupt individuals. It's about a culture that allowed this to happen. We need to rebuild from the ground up." The meeting was tense but productive. By the end, city officials had agreed to implement a task force to oversee police practices and investigate allegations of bias. It was a victory, but it came with a heavy understanding. Reginald and Brian had made powerful enemies. They wouldn't simply disappear. In the weeks that followed, their lives changed. They were celebrated as heroes, though the threats continued. Reginald's home was vandalized one night, a reminder that not everyone appreciated his stand. But each time he thought of stepping back, he remembered the families he had seen outside City Hall. They looked to him now as a symbol of justice. One afternoon, as Reginald sat on his porch, he received a call from Brian. "I just wanted to say thanks." Brian's voice was softer than usual. "We did something important here." Reginald smiled, feeling a rare sense of peace. "This was bigger than us, Brian. And it's far from over. But maybe, just maybe, we've started something that can't be undone." Together, they had faced a system designed to protect the powerful. And together, they had prevailed. They had inspired a community to stand up. And in doing so, they had reminded the world that justice could still be found, even in the darkest corners. As Reginald ended the call, he looked out over the neighborhood he had fought so hard to protect. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. Change was not just possible, it was already underway.